We recently covered a part of church history called the Dark Ages from about 500 AD to 1500 AD. And all of that downhill progress led to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant reformers wanted to get the church back to believing the Bible. They claimed that's what they were doing, restoring believers' faith to Bible faith rather than religious tradition. However, we will find as we go through this study that the Protestant Reformation had a lot of dark spots in it too, at the beginning and down to this day. We've been studying out of this book by Francis McNutt, The Nearly Perfect Crime, where he studies this history about how the church went downhill and got to the point it is today. And people need to know how the church got to the way it is today. In fact, McNutt said this on the back of the cover of this book: the early church would not believe it. The early church believers would not believe how far down the church has gone over 1900 years. And again, we've been studying out of his book, and this section, the title of it is called Enlightenment and Dispensationalism, and he covers both what happened out in the world during that time, about the 1700s and following, that influenced the church. And then he brings out some of the errors that the Protestant version of the church instituted, imbibed, took in, and passed on down to our generation, and we're facing it today. Most people probably do not realize where it came from, but we're finding out in these studies. The term enlightenment is from the world, and it meant they began to see things differently, not religiously, but scientifically, and based on the senses, the five physical senses, and they call that light. But every time the world claims that they're bringing light to us, they're actually bringing darkness to us because their hearts are darkened. They don't believe in God. They eventually got to where they question the existence of God and challenge the Word of God, the Bible. The Holy Bible said it's not valid, and so forth. And we have that with us to this day, and it started during this period of time. Now, John Calvin, we found out, had just about shut down divine healing with his cessationism doctrine, believing and claiming, preaching, convincing many people down to this day that miracles deliberately ceased. God deliberately ceased them after the first 100 years in the church, and they're not supposed to happen today. But also out in the world, something was going on during that time, the 1700s. David Hume, philosopher, declared that the miracles in the life of Jesus never even happened. Not only did they not believe that they don't happen anymore, but he believed that they didn't happen ever, not at all. So, he lived from 1711 to 1776, died the year this nation, USA, was being brought into existence. And he was a Scottish philosopher. And science and religion had been in conflict for some time now after the onset of the Protestant Reformation. In the 18th century, the intellectual atmosphere of Europe, where all this began to take place, drastically changed so that the findings of science and religion were often opposed to one another, and they are. Real science and real biblical truth are complementary to one another, not in opposition to one another. Remember, Galileo discovered that the world was round and not flat, and the earth circulated the sun and not vice versa, and he was put on trial by the Roman Catholic Church for his beliefs, which ran counter to church-cherished doctrines. He survived. But this is serious business. Anybody who challenged that church doctrine, some of them were killed. Many of them were killed during that time. Increasingly, educated Europeans were skeptical of the claims of a church that had lost credibility. If the Roman Catholic Church believed those old Greek doctrines about the world, the universe, they were wrong about that, then the church lost its credibility. So scientific people, thinking people began to depart and downplay the Bible, the church, and so forth. The church lost its credibility. They took on the scientific mentality in which they believed that if you couldn't measure something, put it in a science lab and experiment with it in the natural realm, the five physical senses, then it was not dependable. You could not believe that it actually happened. So David Hume banished any remaining belief in miracles from European secular thought. The liberal wing of Protestantism also no longer tried to defend the historicity of the Gospels, but developed the theory that miracles were myths. So the church tried to explain why they still wanted to be the church by saying, well, we'll agree with you that the miracles were just myths and legends, they never really happened. This all started happening back then, and the influence of that has come down to the modern day church. The New Testament accounts of healings and casting out demons represented not literal physical truths the church came to believe, the liberal side of the church, but rather had spiritual meaning rather than a purely literal understanding. So they began to teach. I ran into this in 1976 in a church college, training for the ministry, the gospel ministry. They began to spiritualize the miracles. They weren't really literal miracles, but were spiritual teachings, about spiritual things, using the settings of outward miracles to demonstrate them. But the outward miracles didn't really take place, they claim. For instance, the healing of the leper, when Jesus healed the leper, that was not a literal healing from leprosy, the physical disease of leprosy, but it had a spiritual meaning, that leprosy of sin. And I've heard that preached. I've heard preachers preach that, the sin of leprosy. They downplay those miracles so that people don't expect miracles outward in their bodies and so forth anymore, but it's a miracle of sin being taken care of. That's started several hundred years ago in the Protestant version of the church and has come down to us today. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes did not actually happen, but it just it demonstrates the love that people began to have listening to Jesus teach. So they began to share the extra bread they carried with them in their big long robes with different pockets in it. And it was a miracle of love. I've heard this stuff preached. I've heard this stuff preached in a church college preparing me for gospel ministry. Can you believe that? Now, there were still some Protestant defenders of Jesus' miracles, but they did not believe that those miracles continue to take place to this day. So there are two sides to the Protestant version of the church. They divided into two camps, the liberal and the conservative, just like in the political realm. The conservatives believed that the miracles did happen in Jesus' day, early in the church, but not anymore. They weren't supposed to happen anymore. The liberal side believed they never happened at all. And it's still that way today. Those divisions are still in the modern church. So, the effects of this secular scientific worldview that divine healing and casting out demons was a remnant of primitive understanding of nature. These believers were Neanderthals. They were from the past, and human beings had evolved and developed far beyond that today. That's what they started teaching in the 1700s in Europe. Another man's name, William Barclay, theologian. This is in the church. Now, we've been studying about what happened in the world, but it infiltrated into the church and affected this man and many other theologians. William Barclay, a very famous theologian, wrote books and Bible commentaries and so forth, and is widespread in many libraries. And he carried the idea against divine healing even further. And this author quoted some of the things Barclay said out of his works, and this is some of them. He suggested that Jesus simply used the power of suggestion when he cast out evil spirits. In other words, it's psychosomatic. It was not real, physical, but it was a mental thing, an emotional thing. This is what this theologian taught, and it's being taught in seminaries to this day, many of them, and many preachers believe that garbage. I ran into some of them. I've encountered some of them in my experiences. He taught, in the Eastern world, back in Jesus' day, all illness was ascribed to demon activity. They believed demons caused it. The Bible teaches that they did, but they said, well, they believed that, but it wasn't really true. So when you believe you were demon-possessed, then you would have symptoms in your body that suggested that. So when Jesus came along and said he cast out the demon and you believe that, then you got better. It's all psychosomatic. That's what's taught. I've heard that word over and over and over. It came out of this period of church history, which had a lot of dark spots in it, and we're already studying about some of those. This author, Francis McNutt, pointed out that William Barclay, in his works, in this section, used the word delusion 3 times. It was a delusion. Demon possession was a delusion. Their healing was a delusion. But Jesus did it. Jesus taught it. And so this author brings out how Barclay suggested that Jesus Christ himself was deluded. This is part A of this most informative video lesson about how the Protestant Reformation got rid of some of the dark spots that had invaded the church and dominated the church for over 1,000 years, but itself, that is, the Protestant Reformation itself, instituted other dark spots in the church that has lasted for 500 years since that time. The rest of this story is seen on Part B and Part C.